The kitchen door hung open. Inside the wooden shack behind the main house, the lamp had been overturned, spilling oil across the floorboards in a dark pool that caught the first pale light of Christmas morning. The bedclothes were soaked through. The iron bedstead had been dragged several feet from the wall, leaving scrape marks in the soft pine floor. Outside, in the frozen yard, a trail led toward the stable, marked not by footprints, but by something else, something that glistened in the pre-dawn frost. She had been 25 years old, a cook, a servant, a woman whose name would appear in the newspapers for 3 days before the city turned its attention elsewhere, before the fear became ordinary, before the next one. In the main house, the family still slept. They had heard nothing. The walls were thick, the night had been cold, and the servant quarters stood far enough back that a scream might have sounded like wind, or the cry of an animal, or nothing at all. The door swung gently in the morning breeze. Inside, the lamp oil spread slowly across the floor, reaching toward the threshold, and the city of Austin, Texas woke to discover that something had returned to its streets, something that had been waiting, something that had never truly left. The year was 1884 and the killing had begun again. Chapter 1. The City on the Colorado. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The hour grows late now, and the world beyond your window has settled into that particular stillness that belongs only to the deep night. I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What time shows on your clock as you hear these words? Wherever you are, whatever the hour, I invite you to settle in, to let the concerns of your day drift away like smoke. If you find value in these journeys through history's darker corridors, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel so that we might travel together through many more forgotten nights. Now, let us leave this moment behind. Let us drift backward through time to a place where the frontier had not yet fully surrendered to civilization, where the night held dangers that no lamp could dispel, and where certain lives were considered so inconsequential that their endings barely troubled the morning newspapers. Let us go to Texas, to a city on the banks of a river, in the years when the frontier was dying but had not yet learned to die quietly. The Colorado River moves slowly through the heart of Austin in the year 1884, carrying the red soil of the Texas hill country southward toward the Gulf. The water ran shallow in summer, deep and swift when the rains came, and along its banks the city had taken root like something that could not quite decide whether it belonged to the wilderness or to the ordered world of the East. The Capitol building rose from the highest ground, its pale limestone walls visible for miles across the surrounding prairie, a declaration of permanence in a place where permanence had always been a wager against flood, drought, and the memory of Comanche raids that had ended barely a generation before. The city proper contained perhaps 15,000 souls, though the count was unreliable, for the census takers did not always trouble themselves with the accuracies of the servant quarters, the shanty districts, or the clusters of dwellings that spread beyond the official boundaries like afterthoughts. Congress Avenue ran straight from the river to the Capitol, paved with wooden blocks that rattled under wagon wheels and absorbed the dust in summer, the mud in winter. Gas lamps had been installed along the main streets, though their light reached only so far, and the alleys between buildings remained as dark as they had been when the Tonkawa people hunted along these same limestone bluffs. The houses of the prosperous families spread eastward from the centre, substantial structures of wood and stone with deep porches and high ceilings designed to capture whatever breeze might offer relief from the brutal summers. Behind these houses, connected by covered walkways or separated by 20 yards of yard, stood the servants' quarters. Small wooden structures, rarely more than one room, with tin roofs that turned them into ovens in August and did little to keep out the cold when the northers blew down from the plains in January. These shacks had no locks worth mentioning. Their doors were fastened with simple latches or leather straps. Their windows, if they had windows, were covered with cloth or thin wooden shutters that any man could pull open with one hand. In these quarters lived the domestic workers who made possible the comfortable lives of Austin's rising class, cooks who rose before dawn to light the kitchen fires, laundresses who spent their days bent over steaming tubs and boiling cauldrons, House girls who swept and scrubbed and carried and cleaned from first light until the last lamp was extinguished. Most were women, or most were former slaves or the daughters of slaves, born into freedom but not into the liberty to choose how they would live. They worked for wages that barely kept them fed, in conditions that would have scandalized the very families who employed them, had those families ever truly looked, truly seen, truly considered what it meant to sleep alone in a wooden shack with no lock on the door, no one to hear a cry for help, nothing between vulnerability and violence but the hope that violence might choose another target. The city did not think about these women. The newspapers rarely printed their names unless they had committed some crime or suffered some spectacular misfortune. They moved through the streets before dawn and after dusk, carrying bundles of laundry, baskets of vegetables from the market, messages from one household to another. They were part of the landscape like the live oaks and the limestone outcroppings, noticed only in their absence, valued only for the labour they provided. The city thought about other things. It thought about the new railroad connections that we were transforming Austin from a remote frontier capital into a junction point for commerce. It thought about the university that had opened its doors just 3 years before in 1883, promising to bring learning and refinement to this rough country. It thought about electric lighting, which had been demonstrated in the Capitol building and in a few of the finer establishments downtown, a miracle of modern science that seemed to promise an end to darkness itself. It thought about growth, prosperity, the steady march of civilization westward. The city thought about its future. It did not think about the women who slept in the servant quarters. It did not think about how easily a man could move through the alleys after midnight, how the dogs rarely barked at a familiar figure, how a door with no lock might as well be an invitation. It did not think about these things until it was forced to think about them, until the bodies began to appear, until the pattern became undeniable. But that thinking lay ahead, in the early months of 1885. In the summer and fall of 1884, the city went about its business. The servant girls woke in their quarters behind the big houses and walked to the kitchens to begin their work. The families they served ate their breakfasts and went about their days without considering who had prepared the food, who had washed the dishes, who would be sleeping alone in that wooden shack when night fell. The streets grew quiet after dark. Gas lamps burned at the corners, casting pools of yellow light that did not quite reach from one post to the next. Between the pools of light lay the stretches of shadow where anything might move unseen. The alleys behind the houses were darker still. No lamps burned there. The moon, when it rose, might illuminate the yards and outbuildings, or it might be hidden behind clouds, and on those moonless nights the darkness was complete, absolute, a darkness that belonged to the prairie and the wilderness, that remembered a time before any light but stars had touched this land. In that darkness a man could move as silent as smoke. He could test a door and find it unlatched. He could step inside a servant's quarters and stand there in the blackness, listening to the sound of breathing, watching the shape beneath the blankets, waiting for the moment to act. He could carry an axe or a knife or an iron bar, and the first blow would come before the victim even woke, and the screams, if there were screams, would be muffled by the distance and walls and the convenient deafness of those who did not wish to hear. The city did not know this yet. The city still believed itself to be safe, civilized, protected by laws and locks and the thin membrane of social order that separated it from chaos. The city still believed that murders were rare, that they happened for reasons, that they could be understood and prevented through ordinary means. The city still believed in daylight logic, in cause and effect, in the power of authority to maintain control. On Christmas Eve of 1884, a cold front moved down from the north, dropping temperatures below freezing. Ice formed in the water troughs. The wind rattled the tin roofs of the servant quarters. Inside the big houses, families gathered around fireplaces and stoves, grateful for solid walls and warm rooms. In the servant quarters, women pulled their thin blankets closer and hoped the cold would pass quickly. The night settled over Austin, like a hand closing around a throat. And somewhere in that darkness, something that had been waiting began to move. The morning of Christmas Day would bring discovery. It would bring horror. It would bring the beginning of a fear that would grip the city for more than a year, that would transform peaceful streets into hunting grounds, that would reveal just how fragile the boundary was between civilization and savagery, between the ordered world of daylight and the terrible freedoms of the dark. But that morning had not yet come, for now the city slept, the river flowed, the wind moved through the live oaks, and in a wooden shack behind a house on Hickory Street, a woman lay sleeping, unaware that she had perhaps an hour left to live, unaware that her name would soon appear in newspapers across Texas, unaware that she would be remembered not for how she lived, but for how she died. The door had no lock. The night was very cold, and Christmas morning was only a few hours away. Chapter 2. Molly Smith. The body was discovered at first light by the family who employed her. They had expected her in the main house kitchen by 5 o'clock to begin preparations for Christmas breakfast, and when she did not appear, someone was sent to rouse her from the servant quarters. What they found in that small wooden structure would be reported in the newspapers with language so carefully chosen, so delicately phrased, that the full horror was obscured beneath layers of Victorian euphemism. The Austin Daily Statesman would write that she had been outraged and murdered. The word outrage carried a specific meaning into the parlance of the time, a meaning that every reader understood without requiring explicit description. Her name was Molly Smith. She had been a cook, approximately 30 years old, though the records were imprecise about such details. She had lived alone in the quarters behind the house on East Hickory Street, in a room that measured perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, furnished with an iron bedstead, a small table, a chair, and a wooden chest that held her few possessions. The door had been forced open, the simple latch splintered away from the frame. Inside, the bedclothes were soaked with blood. The iron poker from the small stove lay on the floor, bent and sticky. The room had been ransacked, though. Whether the killer had been searching for something or simply destroying what little she owned was impossible to determine. She had been struck in the head, multiple blows delivered with such force that the skull had fractured. The wounds suggested an axe or a hatchet, something with a blade and weight behind it. After the blows, after she had been rendered unconscious or dead, the killer had done other things that the newspapers would not describe, things that the attending physician would note in his report with clinical detachment, using Latin terms that created distance between the words and the acts they described. The violence had been extreme. It had continued well past the point of death. It spoke of rage or pleasure, or some combination of the two that civilized minds struggled to comprehend. The city's response was measured and minimal. A brief article appeared in the newspaper. The police were notified. An investigation was opened, in the sense that a few questions were asked of neighbours who had heard nothing, seen nothing, and could offer no useful information. Molly Smith had no family in Austin, or if she did, they did not come forward. She was buried in the city cemetery in an unmarked grave, and within a week the investigation had effectively ceased. There were theories, of course. Perhaps it had been a robbery gone wrong. Perhaps a spurned lover. Perhaps some vagrant passing through the city who had seen an opportunity and taken it. The servant quarters behind the houses on East Hickory Street remained as they had always been. Doors with simple latches. Rooms occupied by women who slept alone. No additional locks were installed. No extra precautions were taken. The assumption, unspoken but universally held, was that this had been an isolated incident, a random tragedy of the sort that occasionally befell people who lived on the margins of society. Terrible, certainly, regrettable, but not something that suggested a pattern or presaged future danger. The winter passed. The cold eased. Spring came to the Colorado River Valley, with bluebonnets covering the hills and mockingbirds singing from the live oaks. The city went about its business. New buildings rose along Congress Avenue. The university held its first commencement ceremony. The railroad brought more settlers, more commerce, more of everything that marked progress and growth. Austin was becoming something more than a frontier town. It was becoming a city in earnest, and cities had no time to dwell on the death of a servant girl whose name most citizens never knew. In the servant quarters throughout the city, women continued their work. They rose before dawn to light the fires. They cooked and cleaned and washed and mended. They walked through the streets in the early morning darkness and the evening dusk, carrying their burdens, speaking little, noticed by almost no one. They slept in their small rooms with their inadequate locks and their thin walls, and if any of them thought about Molly Smith, if any of them felt a chill of recognition or fear, they kept it to themselves. Fear was not something they could afford to indulge. Fear did not pay wages or put food on the table. Fear did not change the fundamental facts of their existence. The weeks became months. January turned to February, February to March, March to April, the newspapers filled with other stories. A fire destroyed a hardware store downtown. The governor gave a speech about education and moral improvement. A man was arrested for stealing horses. The usual catalogue of human events, the ordinary tragedies and triumphs that make up the daily record of a city's life. And then, in early May of 1885, nearly 5 months after Molly Smith had been killed, another servant girl failed to appear for her morning duties. Another family sent someone to check the quarters behind their house. Another body was discovered in circumstances that were horrifyingly familiar to the few people who remembered Christmas Day. Another woman whose name would briefly appear in the newspapers before vanishing into the silence that swallows the unmourned dead. This time the city paid slightly more attention. 2 murders in 5 months, both following the same pattern, both victims drawn from the same vulnerable population, both crimes marked by the same excessive violence. The police issued statements assuring the public that they were investigating vigorously. Patrols were increased in certain neighbourhoods, though not notably in the alleys and yards behind the big houses where the servant quarters stood. Editorials appeared suggesting that women who lived alone should take precautions, should perhaps arrange to sleep in groups, should certainly make sure their doors were properly secured. But still, the fundamental structure remained unchanged. The servant girls continued to sleep in their isolated quarters. The families they served continued to sleep in their comfortable beds in the main houses, separated from their employees by 20 or 30 yards of dark ground. The distance was considered proper, necessary, a reflection of the natural order of things. To suggest that a servant might sleep inside the main house, or that the barrier between employer and employee might be dissolved for the sake of safety, was to suggest something that violated the basic architecture of how society was meant to function. So the distance remained. The servant quarters stood in their places behind the houses, and the women who lived in them made whatever accommodations they could with the new reality. Some acquired dogs, though dogs could be silenced. Some fashioned crude bars for their doors, though a determined man with a crowbar could defeat such measures in seconds. Some began sleeping with knives under their pillows, though a knife was poor defence against an axe, wielded in darkness by someone who had already decided to kill. The city told itself that the problem would be solved. The police would catch the killer. He would be tried and hanged, and order would be restored. This was how civilization worked. This was the promise of law and authority, and the structures that separated the modern world from the chaos of the wilderness. Crime was followed by investigation, investigation by arrest, arrest by punishment. The sequence was inevitable, necessary, the bedrock upon which all social order rested. But May passed into June, and no arrest was made. The investigation produced no suspects, no evidence, no clear direction. The 2 murders stood in the records like questions without answers, and the city, having briefly focused its attention on the matter, allowed that attention to drift elsewhere. Summer arrived with its crushing heat. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees and stayed there for days at a time. People slept on their porches to catch whatever breeze might offer relief. The servant quarters became unbearable ovens, and some women began sleeping outside on the ground under the trees, preferring the slight risk of exposure to the certainty of suffocation. The heat pressed down on Austin like a hand. The river dropped to a trickle. Dust rose from the unpaved streets and settled over everything. The city moved slowly, conserving energy, waiting for the heat to break. And in that slow, heavy time, when everyone was focused on endurance, on surviving until the weather changed, the killer struck again. Not once, but multiple times. Not isolated incidents separated by months, but a concentrated burst of violence that would transform fear into panic and reveal that what the city had experienced in December and May had been merely a prelude to something far worse. Chapter 3: The Servant's World. To understand what happened in Austin. During those months, it is necessary to understand the world that the victims inhabited, the narrow corridors of possibility within which their lives unfold. They were almost without exception women who had been born into slavery or born to parents who had been slaves. The war had ended 20 years before and emancipation had granted them freedom in the legal sense. But freedom without property, without education, without any of the resources that might have allowed them to build lives of genuine independence. They had been freed into a world that still needed their labour, but had no interest in their welfare, that would pay them wages but would not protect them, that would accept their service but would not acknowledge their humanity. The work available to them was domestic service, cooking, cleaning, washing, childcare. Labour performed in white households under white supervision for white benefit. The wages were minimal, typically $4 to $6 per month, barely enough to cover rent and food. The hours were long, stretching from before dawn until after dusk, with the expectation that the servant would be available whenever needed, that personal time was a privilege granted by the employer, rather than a right belonging to the worker. Days off were rare. Sick leave did not exist. Old age or injury meant destitution, for there were no pensions, no savings to fall back on, no safety net of any kind. The living arrangements were dictated by convention and convenience. A servant who lived in the main house would have been scandalous, a violation of the boundaries that were meant to separate the races and the classes. So the servant quarters stood apart, usually at the back of the lot, accessible by a path or alley. These structures were built as cheaply as possible, often by the servants themselves or by unskilled labourers using scrap lumber and salvaged materials. The walls were thin, the roofs leaked. In winter, cold air poured through gaps in the boards. In summer, the tin roofs absorbed heat until the interior became uninhabitable. There was no running water, no indoor plumbing, no gas lighting. A lamp or candle provided illumination. Water was carried from a pump or well. The privy stood several yards away, another small structure that might or might not have a door. Privacy did not exist. The quarters were too small to allow for it, and the nature of the work meant that a servant's time was not her own. An employer might send for her at any hour. She might be required to work late into the night if guests were being entertained, then expected to rise at the usual early hour to begin the next day's labour. Her room, such as it was, served as bedroom, sitting room and storage space. Everything she owned had to fit within those few square feet. A bed, a chair, perhaps a small table or chest, a change of clothes, a few personal items, nothing more, because there was no room for more, and because accumulation of possessions was a luxury available only to those who had security. Security was something they did not have. The doors had simple latches that could be opened from outside with minimal effort. Windows, when they existed, could be pried open or broken. The structures stood isolated, far enough from the main house that sounds would be muffled or lost entirely. The alleys behind the houses were unlit, unpatrolled, unwatched. After dark, they became corridors of shadow where anyone could move unseen. The police did not patrol these areas. The gas lamps that illuminated the main streets did not extend to the service alleys. The assumption was that respectable people had no business in such places after nightfall, and that those who did inhabit them were responsible for their own protection. But protection required resources that the servant girls did not possess. A strong lock required money, a dog required money, even a sturdy door required money, and the wages they earned left almost nothing after food and rent were paid. They lived at the edge of survival, one missed day of work away from hunger. one injury away from homelessness. They could not afford to be sick. They could not afford to be injured. They could not afford to be afraid, because fear did not change anything, and indulging it would only make the unbearable weight of daily existence that much heavier. They formed communities among themselves, networks of mutual support that existed beneath the notice of White Austin. They shared information, resources, warnings. When one woman found steady work, she might help another find a position. When sickness struck, others would provide food or care. When death came, they would pool their meagre resources to ensure a burial, however simple. These networks operated invisibly, never acknowledged in the official record, never appearing in the newspapers or the city directories or the census reports. They existed in the spaces between official recognition, in the early morning hours before the city woke, in the conversations held in kitchens and washhouses, in the quiet exchanges that took place when white eyes were not watching. They knew things that White Austin did not know. They knew which employers were kind and which were cruel. They knew which neighborhoods were safe to walk through and which should be avoided. They knew where a woman alone might find help if she needed it, and where she would find only indifference or worse. This knowledge was survival knowledge, passed from woman to woman, tested by experience, refined by the hard lessons of living, in a world that did not care whether they lived or died. When Molly Smith was killed, the word spread through these networks long before the newspapers printed their sanitized accounts. The women who worked as cooks and laundresses and housegirls heard the details that the papers omitted, the specifics that made clear just how violent the death had been, how prolonged, how deliberate. They understood what it meant in ways that White Austin did not. They understood that this was not a robbery gone wrong or a lover's quarrel. They understood that someone had entered a servant's quarters and taken his time, that he had done things that required privacy and opportunity, that he had felt secure enough in his actions to linger, to indulge whatever impulses had driven him there. And they understood that it could happen to any of them, that the door they latched at night would not keep out someone who wanted to enter, that the isolation that was forced upon them by social convention made them vulnerable in ways that could not be remedied by caution or prayer, or any of the small precautions available to the powerless. They understood, in short, that they were prey, and that the predator had marked their particular population as his hunting ground. But what could they do with this understanding? They could not quit their positions, for they had no other means of support. They could not demand better housing, for they had no leverage with which to make demands. They could not go to the police and insist on protection, for the police did not consider the safety of servant girls to be a priority worth pursuing. They could not even speak openly about their fear, for to do so would be to risk being seen as troublesome, difficult, the sort of employee who caused problems and could be easily replaced. So they continued their work. They woke in the dark and walked to the kitchens. They lit the fires and prepared the meals and washed the dishes and scrubbed the floors. They smiled when required and kept their eyes down and spoke only when spoken to. They performed the elaborate dance of subservience that was expected of them, the performance of contentment and loyalty that white employers mistook for the actual state of their hearts. And at night, they returned to their quarters and barred the doors as best they could and lay awake in the darkness, listening for footsteps, listening for the sound of a door being tested, listening for the creak of a board or the scrape of a tool against wood or the breathing of someone who should not be there, listening, and knowing that if the sounds came, there would be no time to cry for help, no one close enough to hear, no intervention possible. Listening and understanding that survival was not a matter of skill or caution, but of luck, of not being chosen, of hoping that the predator would select someone else. The spring of 1885 passed in this manner. The days were ordinary, the nights were terrifying, and when May brought the second murder, the murder of Eliza Shelley, the fear that had been lurking just beneath the surface erupted into something closer to panic, though it was a panic that remained largely invisible to White Austin, confined to the servant quarters and the washhouses and the kitchens where women who could not afford to show fear continued to perform their duties while knowing that any night might be their last. Chapter 4. Eliza Shelley. She was found on the morning of May the 7th, 1885, in the servant quarters behind a house on San Marcos Street. Like Molly Smith, she had been a domestic worker, a cook, A woman whose existence had been defined by service and whose death would be remembered, if at all, only as part of a pattern. The circumstances were nearly identical to the Christmas murder. The door forced open, the body on the bed, the head crushed by repeated blows, the signs of assault that the newspapers would describe only as outrage. The ransacked room, though nothing of value appeared to have been taken, the similarities were impossible to dismiss. 2 women, both domestic servants, both living alone in quarters behind their employers' houses, both killed in the same manner, both subjected to the same violence that extended well beyond what was necessary to cause death. The police, who had treated the first murder as an isolated incident, were forced to acknowledge the possibility of a connection. The newspapers, which had given Molly Smith's death only brief mention, devoted more space to Eliza Shelley, though still with the careful language that avoided explicit description of what had been done to her. The investigation intensified, at least in the official statements issued by the city marshal and the police department. Detectives were assigned, witnesses were interviewed, theories were developed and pursued. The examination of the crime scene revealed little. No clear footprints, no useful evidence left behind. The killer had apparently entered through the door, committed his acts, and departed without leaving any trace that might identify him. The weapon used to deliver the fatal blows had not been found at the scene, suggesting that the killer had brought it with him and taken it away again. The timing of the attack was estimated to have occurred in the early morning hours, perhaps between 2 and 4 o'clock, when the city was at its quietest and darkest. No one in the main house had heard anything. The neighbours, questioned extensively, reported nothing unusual. The night had been calm. No screams had disturbed the silence. Either the victim had been killed before she could cry out, or her cries had gone unheard, muffled by distance and walls and the deep sleep of people who had learned not to notice sounds from the servant quarters. A description began to emerge, assembled from fragments and possibilities rather than from any clear witness testimony. The killer was likely a man, given the strength required to deliver such devastating blows. He was familiar with the layout of the servant quarters, knew which houses had servants living alone, understood the patterns of their work and rest. He moved with confidence through the alleys and yards, suggesting local knowledge rather than the random wandering of a stranger. He chose victims who were isolated and vulnerable, women who could be attacked without risk of immediate discovery. The city responded with recommendations rather than protections. The newspapers advised women living alone to ensure their doors were securely fastened. Ministers preached sermons about the dangers of modern life and the need for vigilance. Employers were encouraged to check on their servants more frequently, though few took this advice, for it would have required a level of involvement in the servants' lives that violated the comfortable distance that was meant to exist between the classes. In the servant quarters throughout Austin, the women made what preparations they could. Some fashioned weapons from kitchen implements, knives or rolling pins that could be reached quickly in the dark. Some arranged to sleep in pairs, though this required finding someone willing to share their already cramped quarters and convincing an employer that the arrangement was acceptable. Some simply resigned themselves to whatever might come, too exhausted by the demands of daily survival to sustain the energy that constant vigilance required. The police made their rounds with increased frequency, at least for a few weeks. Officers walked through the neighbourhoods where the murders had occurred, questioning residents, taking note of suspicious persons, making their presence visible. But the patrols did not extend to the alleys behind the houses. They did not include the servant quarters in their regular checks. The protection offered was symbolic rather than practical, a gesture toward concern rather than a genuine effort to prevent future attacks. The weeks following Eliza Shelley's murder passed without incident. May became June. The heat arrived with its usual intensity. The city began to relax slightly, to hope that perhaps the worst was over, that 2 murders might be the extent of the tragedy. The investigation continued in theory, but with no new leads and no clear suspects, it gradually lost momentum. Detectives turned their attention to other crimes, other demands on their limited time and resources. The case files remained open, but the active pursuit of answers slowed and then effectively stopped. The women in the servant quarters knew better than to relax. They had learned through centuries of bitter experience that the absence of immediate danger did not mean safety. They understood that predators hunted on their own schedules, that silence might mean only that the hunter was resting, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to strike again. They went about their work with a wariness that never entirely faded, a tension that lived in their shoulders and their shortened breath and the way they startled at unexpected sounds. Summer deepened. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees and stayed there. The grass turned brown. The river shrank to a series of pools connected by trickles of water. People moved slowly, seeking shade, conserving energy. The nights brought little relief. The air remained thick and hot even after the sun went down. Sleep became difficult, and in the servant quarters, where the tin roofs held the day's heat like ovens, it became nearly impossible. Women moved their pallets outside, sleeping under the trees or on the porches of their small dwellings, preferring the slight risk of exposure to the certainty of suffocation. On the evening of August 29th, the Saturday, the city settled into its weekend rhythms. Downtown, the saloons filled with men seeking relief from the heat and the week's labour. In the residential neighbourhoods, families sat on their porches, fanning themselves, speaking in desultory tones about the weather and the hope of rain. In the servant quarters, women completed their day's work and retreated to their rooms, or to whatever spots they had found that offered the possibility of rest. The next morning, 3 more bodies were discovered. 3 servant girls killed in the same night, their deaths following the same terrible pattern that had marked the murders of Molly Smith and Eliza Shelley. The city woke to find that what had seemed like isolated incidents, tragic but containable, had transformed into something else entirely. A pattern, a campaign, a concentrated assault on the most vulnerable members of the community, carried out with a method and purpose that could no longer be dismissed as the work of a common criminal. The summer of blood had begun, and Austin would never be the same. Chapter 5, The Summer of Blood. The first of the 3 was discovered just after dawn on Sunday, the 30th of August. Her name was Clara Dick, and she had worked as a cook for a family on West Pecan Street. The servant quarters stood at the rear of the property, separated from the main house by perhaps 30 yards of yard and a kitchen garden that had withered in the heat. The door hung open. Inside, the familiar scene of devastation awaited. The bedclothes soaked through, the skull fractured by multiple blows. The body positioned in a manner that suggested the killer had taken his time, had done more than simply murder, had indulged impulses that went beyond the pragmatic goal of silencing a victim. The second body lay 2 streets away, behind a house on East Cypress Street. Eliza Irwin had been a laundress, 25 years old, living alone in the quarters that were even more rudimentary than most, little more than a shed with a cot and a trunk. She had been killed in the same manner as Clara Dick, with the same excessive violence, the same evidence of assault, the same careful positioning of the body that suggested ritual or satisfaction, or some purpose that remained opaque to those who found her. The third victim was discovered shortly before noon, after the news of the first 2 murders had begun to spread through the city. Bridget Sullivan had worked as a house servant on East Live Oak Street. Unlike the other victims, she was white, a fact that would complicate the investigation and the city's response in ways that revealed the hierarchies of value that governed which deaths mattered and which could be quietly forgotten. She had been killed with the same weapon or type of weapon, struck down with the same ferocity, subjected to the same violations. The killer had apparently made no distinction based on race. He had selected victims based on other criteria: isolation, vulnerability, opportunity. 3 murders in one night. The same method. The same type of victim, women who lived alone in servant quarters. The same time frame, the early morning hours when the city slept deepest. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. This was not random violence. This was deliberate, planned, executed with a confidence that suggested either madness or a complete absence of fear regarding consequences. The city's reaction was immediate and profound. Church services that Sunday morning were disrupted by the news. Congregations that had gathered for worship found themselves instead discussing murder, safety, the dissolution of the social order that had seemed so secure just days before. Ministers abandoned their prepared sermons and spoke instead about evil, about the presence of wickedness in the world, about the need for vigilance and faith in times of darkness. The language was biblical, apocalyptic, for the ordinary vocabulary of crime and punishment seemed inadequate to address what was happening. By Monday morning, the newspapers had filled their pages with coverage. The Austin Daily Statesman devoted nearly its entire front page to the murders, with headlines that spoke of fiendish crimes and diabolical outrages. The articles described the crime scenes in more detail than had been provided for the earlier murders, though still with careful euphemisms that avoided explicit description. The focus fell heavily on Bridget Sullivan, the white victim, whose death seemed to carry more weight in the public imagination than those of the two black women killed the same night. The editorial pages called for immediate action, for arrests, for justice, for protection of the innocent. The police department found itself overwhelmed. 3 crime scenes to process, dozens of witnesses to interview, a city demanding answers that no one could provide. The detective force, which consisted of perhaps half a dozen men responsible for all criminal investigations in Austin, had neither the training nor the resources to handle a case of this magnitude. They worked from instinct and experience, following procedures that had been developed for solving ordinary crimes: theft, assault, the occasional murder that resulted from a fight or a domestic dispute. They had no framework for understanding a killer who struck multiple victims in one night, who left no clear evidence, who seemed to move through the city like a ghost. The examination of the crime scenes revealed patterns but not answers. The killer entered through doors that were easily forced. He brought his weapon with him, likely an axe given the nature of the wounds. He struck from behind or while the victim slept, delivering blows of such force that death or unconsciousness came quickly. What followed the initial attack varied in duration, but followed a consistent pattern of assault and violation. The positioning of the bodies, the state of the rooms, all suggested someone who felt no urgency to flee, who believed himself safe from discovery even as he took his time with his victims. Witness testimony proved unreliable. Some neighbours claimed to have heard sounds in the night, though the descriptions varied wildly. A scream, a cry, the bark of a dog, the slam of a door. But these sounds had not seemed remarkable at the time, had been dismissed as ordinary noises of the night, and only in retrospect, knowing what had occurred, did they take on significance. No one reported seeing a figure moving through the alleys. No one could describe a suspicious person leaving the area. The killer had come and gone without leaving any impression on the consciousness of those who lived nearby. The investigation cast a wide net. Known criminals were questioned. Men with records of violence were brought in for interrogation. Vagrants and drifters were rounded up and held on suspicion. The police operated on the assumption that the killer must be someone recognizable as dangerous, someone whose appearance or behavior would mark him as a threat. But the questioning produced nothing useful. Alibis were verified or could not be broken. The men held on suspicion were eventually released. The actual killer remained unknown, unnamed, faceless. Theories multiplied. Perhaps it was a madman, someone whose mind had been destroyed by disease or injury and who killed in a frenzy without plan or purpose. Perhaps it was someone with a grudge against a particular family, acting out revenge by targeting their servants. Perhaps it was a racial crime, though the inclusion of Bridget Sullivan complicated this theory. Perhaps it was sexual in nature, the work of someone whose desires had twisted into violence. Perhaps it was something darker still, ritualistic, occult, connected to practices that civilized minds preferred not to acknowledge. The city organized itself for protection. Citizens formed watch committees, groups of armed men who would patrol the neighborhoods at night. The volunteer patrols focused on the white residential areas, offering protection to families who felt themselves threatened. The servant quarters received less attention, though some employers did arrange for additional security, hiring guards or installing better locks or requiring their servants to sleep in groups. Their measures were inconsistent, dependent on the individual employer's level of concern and willingness to spend money on the safety of their workers. Gun sales increased dramatically. Hardware stores sold out their stock of pistols and ammunition. Men who had never owned firearms purchased them now, along with boxes of cartridges and cleaning supplies. The newspapers carried advertisements for various models of revolvers, with special emphasis on those suitable for home defense. The armed populace created its own dangers, as nervous citizens fired at shadows, at each other, at innocent people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Several men were shot by jumpy householders who mistook them for intruders. The violence bred more violence, fear amplifying fear until the entire city seemed to exist in a state of barely controlled panic. September arrived with no relief from the heat and no break in the tension. The investigation continued without producing results. The patrols walked their routes without encountering the killer. The newspapers continued their daily coverage, tracking the progress of the case, interviewing officials, printing theories and speculation, and increasingly desperate calls for action. The editorials grew more strident. Why had no arrest been made? Why were the police unable to protect the citizens? What good were laws and authorities if they could not stop a killer who struck with such impunity? And then, on the night of September 6th, barely a week after the triple murder, the killer struck again. This time the victim was a woman named Mary Ramey, who worked as a cook on West Hickory Street. The circumstances were identical. The early morning attack, the crushed skull, the evidence of prolonged assault, the body left in a position that seemed almost displayed, as if the killer wanted his work to be seen and understood. 5 days later, on September 11th, another body was found. Rebecca Ramey, no relation to Mary despite the shared surname, killed in her quarters behind a house on Cypress Creek. The pattern held. The method remained consistent. The killer continued his work with a regularity that suggested neither hesitation nor fear of capture. The city descended into something approaching hysteria. Families who could afford to do so sent their women and children away, to relatives in other towns, to the countryside, anywhere that seemed safer than Austin. Those who remained fortified their homes. Doors were reinforced. Windows were barred. Dogs were acquired and chained in yards. Men slept with weapons within reach. The night belonged to fear, and the dawn brought only the dread of what might have occurred in the darkness. The servant quarters emptied as women fled the city or demanded to sleep inside the main houses. Propriety be damned. Employers found themselves without help, forced to do their own cooking and cleaning, or to make accommodations they would have considered unthinkable weeks before. The social structure that had seemed so solid revealed itself to be contingent, dependent on the willingness of vulnerable people to accept risk in exchange for survival wages. When the risk became too great, the structure collapsed, and the comfortable lives of Austin's prosperous families suddenly required them to confront the labour that had always been invisible, performed by people they had barely noticed. The police brought in experts from other cities, though what expertise might apply to this situation remained unclear. A detective from San Antonio spent 3 days reviewing the evidence and departed without offering any useful insights. A former Texas Ranger was hired to lead the investigation, his frontier experience considered valuable despite its irrelevance to this particular type of crime. The investigation expanded and contracted, following leads that evaporated upon examination, pursuing theories that collapsed under scrutiny. August gave way to September, and September wore on toward October, and the killing did not stop. The city lived in the shadow of violence, waiting for the next attack, knowing it would come but unable to prevent it. The women in the remaining servant quarters slept with weapons and prayers. The men on patrol walked their routes with increasing fatigue and decreasing hope. And somewhere in the city, moving through spaces that no one watched, the killer continued his work, choosing his victims, planning his approach, satisfying whatever need or compulsion drove him into the darkness night after night. Chapter 6. The fear takes hold. The city transformed. Within weeks of the August murders, Austin became a place where ordinary life had been suspended, replaced by a state of perpetual alert that exhausted everyone who lived through it. The streets that had once been busy after dark grew empty. The restaurants and theatres that had provided evening entertainment closed early or shuttered entirely, unable to attract customers who refused to leave their homes once the sun went down. The social gatherings that had marked the rhythm of the city's life, the dinners and parties and visits that connected families and maintained the web of relationships that defined community, ceased almost entirely. The gas lamps burned brightly along the main streets, but they illuminated emptiness. An occasional patrol passed, armed men walking in groups of 4 or 5, their eyes scanning the shadows, their hands never far from their weapons. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the buildings, the only sound in a silence that felt oppressive, unnatural, a silence that belonged to abandoned places rather than to a functioning city. In the residential neighbourhoods, the transformation was even more pronounced. Houses that had kept their windows open to catch the evening breeze now stood shuttered and barred. Porches that had served as gathering places, where families would sit in the relative cool of evening and watch their neighbours pass by, stood empty. The trees that lined the streets rustled in the wind with no one to hear them. The yards where children had played until dusk now cleared well before sunset. Parents calling their offspring inside with voices edged with panic barely held in check. The servant quarters behind the houses stood mostly vacant. Of the hundreds of domestic workers who had lived in these structures, perhaps a third remained. The rest had fled, either leaving Austin entirely or moving into the main houses despite the social impropriety, or crowding together in boarding houses where numbers provided at least the illusion of safety. Those who remained did so because they had no choice, because they lacked the resources to leave or the connections that might provide alternative shelter. They slept with axes beside their beds, with chairs propped against their doors, with every sense attuned to the sounds of the night. The fear manifested in strange ways. A woman seen walking alone after sunset would be stopped by patrols, questioned about her business, escorted to her destination whether she wanted the escort or not. A sound heard in the night would bring men running from multiple houses, armed and ready, often firing at shadows or at each other in the confusion. The newspapers printed lists of precautions to take, recommendations that grew more elaborate with each passing week. Bar your doors, shutter your windows, keep weapons ready. Stay inside after dark. Trust no one. The advice was probably sound, but it described a life under siege. An existence defined by fear rather than by any normal human activity. The economic impact rippled through every level of society. Businesses that depended on evening trade failed. Workers who travelled to and from jobs in the dark found themselves unemployed, as employers decided that any labour requiring night movement was not worth the risk. The domestic service economy, already strained by the flight of servants, collapsed further as families discovered they could not hire replacement workers at any price. The women who might have taken these positions refused to sleep in isolated quarters, and their families would not accept servants sleeping in their homes, creating an impasse that left both sides desperate but unable to compromise. The newspapers became chronicles of a city eating itself alive, reports of violence committed by the vigilante patrols, stories of innocent people shot by nervous householders, accounts of families ruined by the economic disruption. The coverage of the actual murders continued, but it competed for space with the coverage of the chaos that the murders had unleashed. The killer was destroying Austin without needing to kill anyone at all, simply by establishing fear as the dominant fact of existence. The investigation, if it could still be called that, had devolved into confusion and desperation. Dozens of men had been arrested on suspicion, held for days or weeks, then released when no evidence connected them to the crimes. The police cells filled and emptied in a cycle that satisfied the public demand for action but produced no actual results. Some of those arrested were clearly innocent. their only crime being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or fitting some vague description that might apply to hundreds of men. Others were guilty of various offences but not of murder. Still others were simply convenient targets, people whose appearance or behaviour marked them as outsiders, as different, as the sort of person who might commit such crimes even if no evidence suggested they actually had. The racial dynamics of the investigation created their own tensions. The early victims had been primarily black women, and the response from white Austin had been measured, concerned, but not panicked. The murder of Bridget Sullivan, a white woman, had escalated the fear considerably. Now the investigation focused heavily on black men as potential suspects, operating on assumptions about race and violence that had no basis in the actual evidence, but reflected the prejudices of the time. Black men found themselves subject to arbitrary stops, searches, arrests. Some were beaten during interrogations. Several were nearly lynched by mobs that formed spontaneously, only dispersing when cooler heads prevailed, or when it became clear that the target was demonstrably innocent. The theory that gained the most traction in certain circles was that the killer must be black, that he was targeting the servant community from within, that his familiarity with the quarters and the routines of the victims suggested he was himself part of that world. But this theory could not account for the murder of Bridget Sullivan, and it ignored the testimony of the few witnesses who claimed to have seen someone suspicious near the crime scenes, descriptions that varied so wildly as to be useless, but that generally did not match the racial profile. Other theories placed the blame elsewhere. Perhaps the killer was a Mexican, suggested some, playing on fears and prejudices directed at the Hispanic population. Perhaps a Native American, invoking old terrors of savage violence. Perhaps a foreigner of some other kind, someone whose otherness explained his capacity for acts that seemed beyond the pale of human behaviour as white Austin understood it. The theories multiplied, each one serving to direct suspicion away from the majority population, maintaining the comfortable fiction that such evil must come from outside, from the other, from anyone except the respectable citizens who made up the city's established community. The religious response intensified. Churches that had been moderately attended now filled beyond capacity. Prayer meetings occurred nightly, seeking divine intervention to stop the killing. Some ministers preached that the murders were a judgment, punishment for the city's sins, a call to repentance and moral reform. Others focused on the presence of evil in the world, the reality of wickedness that must be resisted through faith and righteousness. The theological interpretations varied, but the underlying message was consistent. This was not merely a criminal matter, but a spiritual crisis, a test of the community's soul. Revival meetings drew enormous crowds. Travelling preachers found in Austin an audience desperate for hope, for explanation, for any framework that might make sense of the senseless violence. The sermons were fiery, apocalyptic, filled with imagery of darkness and light, of battles between good and evil. People wept openly, fell to their knees, pledged themselves to virtue and vigilance. Whether any of this had any effect on the killer, whether he attended these meetings or heard these sermons, or cared at all about the spiritual anguish he was causing, remained unknown. October arrived with temperatures finally beginning to moderate. The heat that had pressed down on the city all summer eased. The nights grew cooler, rain fell occasionally, settling the dust, bringing relief to the parched landscape. But the change in weather brought no change in the situation. The killer remained active. The investigation remained stalled. The fear remained unabated. On October the 23rd, another servant girl was found dead in her quarters. The circumstances were identical. The pattern held. The city, which had perhaps begun to hope that the worst might be over, realised that nothing had changed, that the killing would continue until someone stopped it, or until the killer simply decided to stop on his own. The night after this latest murder, fires broke out across the city. Small blazes mostly, set in trash heaps and empty buildings, none causing major damage but all creating additional chaos and terror. Whether the fires were connected to the murders, Whether they were set by the killer or by copycat criminals or by people whose minds had cracked under the strain of sustained fear, no one could determine. The fires added another layer of anxiety, another thing to watch for, another way that the darkness might bring destruction. November came, the servant quarters stood empty, the alleys lay silent. The patrols walked their routes with the exhausted determination of men who knew they were performing a futile gesture but had nothing else to offer. And in houses throughout Austin, people lay awake in the darkness, listening, waiting, knowing that somewhere in the city a killer moved through the night, choosing his next victim, planning his next attack, continuing his work with a patience and persistence that suggested he would never stop, that this would go on forever, that the fear would become permanent, a condition of life rather than a temporary crisis. Chapter 7. Christmas Eve. The city had endured more than a year of terror when December of 1885 arrived. The fear that had been acute in the summer and fall had settled into something more chronic, a permanent alteration of how life was lived rather than a temporary emergency. People had adapted to the new reality, had found ways to continue their existence within the constraints imposed by the threat of violence. The adaptations were incomplete and unsatisfying, but they allowed for a return to something that resembled ordinary life, at least during daylight hours. The servant population had reorganized itself around safety rather than convention. Women no longer slept alone in isolated quarters except in cases of absolute necessity. They grouped together in boarding houses, shared rooms in the main houses when employers allowed it, or left domestic service entirely and found other work that did not require them to be vulnerable in the night. The families who had relied on live-in domestic help adjusted to new arrangements or did without. The social structure had been permanently altered by the violence. The old assumptions about how households should be organized revealed as inadequate to protect those who made the households function. The number of murders had slowed in November. After the late October killing, several weeks had passed without incident. The city began to cautiously hope that perhaps the crisis had ended, that the killer had been scared off by the patrols and the vigilance, or had left Austin, or had died, or had simply satisfied whatever urge had driven him. The newspapers reported each day without a new murder as evidence of progress. The patrols continued, but with less intensity. Some families who had sent women and children away began to bring them back. The theatres reopened. The restaurants extended their hours. Life crept back toward normalcy. Christmas approached with a mixture of relief and residual anxiety. The holiday season offered a chance to celebrate survival, to gather with family, to assert that life would continue despite the fear that had dominated the year. Churches planned special services. Families prepared traditional meals. Children looked forward to gifts and treats. The city decorated itself with greenery and candles, attempting to create an atmosphere of joy and peace that might push back against the darkness that had threatened to overwhelm everything. On Christmas Eve, the weather was unusually mild for late December. The temperature remained above freezing even after sunset. A light breeze moved through the streets, carrying the scent of wood smoke from fireplaces and the sound of voices from houses where families gathered to observe the holiday. The mood was cautiously optimistic. Perhaps the worst truly was over. Perhaps the new year would bring a return to safety and normalcy. Perhaps the nightmare that had begun exactly 1 year ago with the murder of Molly Smith had finally run its course. The Austin Statesman would later report that December 24th, 1885, was the night the killer crossed a threshold that changed everything. Until this night, all the victims had been servants, women who lived in isolated quarters, whose deaths could be attributed to their vulnerable circumstances. The pattern had been consistent enough that white families, despite their fear, could tell themselves that they were not truly at risk, that the killer targeted a specific population to which they did not belong. This comfort vanished on Christmas morning when 2 bodies were discovered, and neither victim was a servant living in isolated quarters. The first was Susan Hancock, wife of Moses Hancock, a respectable white family man who worked as a carpenter. They lived in a house on East Cypress Street, Not a mansion by any means, but a proper dwelling, and Susan slept not in a separate servant structure but in the main house with her husband. She had been killed in her bed, with her husband sleeping beside her. Moses Hancock woke to find his wife dead, her skull crushed and himself wounded, struck on the head but not fatally. He had no memory of the attack, had been unconscious throughout, had awoken to a horror that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. In the same house, in another room, the body of a young girl was found. She was not the Hancock's daughter, but a visitor, a child who had been staying with the family for the holiday. She had been killed in the same manner as Susan Hancock. The presence of a child among the victims represented a new level of horror, a violation of innocence that shocked even a city that had grown accustomed to murder. The second crime scene was discovered several hours later, after word of the Hancock murders had spread and the police had begun their investigation. On Olive Street, in another house that was not a servant quarters but a proper residence, the bodies of Eula Phillips and her 3 children were found. Eula had been a widow trying to support her family through sewing and laundry work. The house was modest but respectable. The family had been preparing for Christmas, and the evidence suggested they had been killed while they slept, struck down without warning or chance to defend themselves. The pattern had shifted. The killer had moved from isolated servant quarters to main houses. He had killed white women who were not servants. He had killed children. The comfortable distance that had allowed some citizens to feel safe, the belief that the violence was contained to a specific population, evaporated in an instant. No one was safe. The killer made no distinctions. He would enter any house, kill anyone, and the fact that he had done so while others slept nearby, while husbands lay unconscious and children were present, demonstrated a level of boldness that suggested he feared nothing and no one. The city's response was immediate and total. Christmas Day, which should have been spent in celebration and rest, became a day of panic and rage. The streets filled with armed men. Mobs formed, seeking targets for their fear and anger. Every stranger, every person who looked even slightly suspicious, became a potential victim of mob violence. Several men were beaten. One was nearly hanged before being rescued by police. The thin veneer of civilization that had held despite a year of terror finally cracked, and what emerged was chaos barely distinguishable from the violence it sought to avenge. The police department mobilized every available officer. The patrols that had been walking the streets for months intensified to the point that armed men stood on nearly every corner. Detectives worked through the holiday, interviewing neighbors, examining crime scenes, pursuing any lead, no matter how tenuous. The state government offered a reward for information leading to the killer's capture. Private citizens and organizations added to the reward fund until it reached several $1,000s, an enormous sum that attracted professional bounty hunters and amateur investigators from across Texas. The crime scenes yielded more evidence than previous murders, perhaps because the killer had been forced to work more quickly in occupied houses, perhaps because he had grown careless. Footprints were found outside the Hancock house, though the quality of the impressions made them difficult to analyze. A piece of torn cloth was discovered that might have come from the killer's clothing. This is reported seeing a figure moving through the area in the hours before the murders, though the descriptions varied so widely that they might have referred to several different people or to no one at all. The investigation focused on a new theory. If the killer was now entering occupied houses and attacking whole families, he must possess unusual strength, confidence, and skill. He must be someone accustomed to violence, perhaps a former soldier or lawman, someone trained in the methods of killing. He must be familiar enough with the city to move through it unseen, yet different enough that he did not arouse suspicion during daylight hours. The profile that emerged was of a competent, intelligent predator who had been operating among them for more than a year, who had adapted his methods as the city adapted its defenses, who was always one step ahead of the authorities. The Christmas murders marked the culmination of the terror, but also, though no one could know it at the time, the beginning of the end. The killer had achieved maximum impact, had demonstrated that nowhere was safe, that no precautions could guarantee protection. He had proven his power over the city in the most dramatic way possible, and having done so, having established his dominance so completely, he would soon disappear, leaving behind only questions and the weight of memory that would burden Austin for generations. But on Christmas Day of 1885, as families huddled in their homes and armed men patrolled the streets and the bodies were carried away for burial, no one knew that the worst of the actual killing was over. They knew only that the nightmare had deepened, that the terror had spread beyond any boundaries, that the darkness had proven itself capable of reaching anywhere, touching anyone, destroying whatever stood in its path. Chapter 8. The Malay Cook. The city demanded a suspect, and on the 26th of December, barely 36 hours after the Christmas murders, the police provided one. His name was given in the newspapers as Morris, though some reports called him simply the Malay. He was a cook employed by various families over the preceding months, a man whose dark skin and foreign appearance marked him immediately as other, as different, as exactly the sort of person upon whom suspicion could comfortably rest. He had been working for a family near Olive Street, not far from where Eula Phillips and her children had been killed. Someone remembered seeing him in the area on Christmas Eve. Someone else recalled that he had been dismissed from a previous position under circumstances that involved some minor dispute. These fragments of information, none of them particularly damning in isolation, combined in the fevered atmosphere of post-Christmas Austin to create what seemed like a compelling case. The police arrested him on suspicion of murder, and the newspapers immediately proclaimed that the killer had been caught. The evidence against Morris was entirely circumstantial. He had been in the vicinity of one of the crime scenes. He had access to kitchens and thus to the axes and knives that might serve as murder weapons. He was a transient worker who moved between households, which could explain how the killer knew the layouts of different properties and the routines of various servants. His appearance was foreign, strange, marking him as someone capable of acts that White Austin preferred to believe were beyond the capacity of their own population. But there was no physical evidence connecting him to any of the murders. No witness had seen him at any crime scene. No victim's belongings were found in his possession. The case against him rested entirely on the fact that he was convenient, that he fit a profile that allowed the city to believe the nightmare might be over, that arresting him would restore the sense of safety that had been shattered. The police interrogated him extensively. The methods used were not recorded in detail, but the standards of the time permitted considerable physical coercion during questioning. Morris maintained his innocence throughout. He provided alibis for some of the murders, though the alibis were difficult to verify and depended on testimony from other members of the servant community whose word carried little weight in White Austin's estimation. He could not account for all of his movements on all of the relevant nights, but few working men could, and the inability to provide a complete accounting was treated as evidence of guilt rather than as the normal condition of someone whose life was not considered important enough to be precisely documented. The arrest satisfied the public demand for action. The newspapers praised the police for their swift work. The reward money that had been offered was claimed by the officers involved in the arrest, though they had done nothing more than pick up a convenient suspect based on the flimsiest of pretexts. The citizen patrols began to stand down. Families who had been living in terror allowed themselves to believe that the crisis had passed. The fact that Morris had been in custody for weeks while murders continued to occur was conveniently ignored or explained away through increasingly tortured logic. Morris was held in the city jail for months while prosecutors attempted to build a case that might result in conviction. The longer he remained in custody without being charged, the more the initial certainty about his guilt began to erode. Defense attorneys, appointed by the court because Morris could not afford to hire his own representation, pointed out the complete absence of any real evidence. They demonstrated that the timeline of his employment and movements made it impossible for him to have been present at several of the murder scenes. They challenged the racial assumptions that underlay the entire case against him. The prosecution struggled. They could not produce witnesses who had seen Morris commit any crime. They could not connect him to any of the murder weapons. They could not explain how he had managed to kill multiple victims in a single night when the crime scenes were miles apart and he had no known access to transportation. The case, examined in daylight rather than in the panic of Christmas week, revealed itself to be without substance. Other suspects emerged as the investigation continued. A man named Nathan Elgin, who worked various jobs around the city, was arrested after being found in possession of some items that might have belonged to one of the victims. The provenance of the items could not be established with certainty, and Elgin provided a plausible explanation for how he had acquired them through legitimate means. He was held for questioning, released, arrested again when public pressure demanded visible action, released again when no case could be constructed. A doctor named Ralph Steiner came under suspicion when it was discovered he had made inquiries about some of the victims before their deaths. The inquiries turned out to be connected to his medical practice, and the suspicion attached to him reflected nothing more than the desperation of investigators who had no real leads and were willing to pursue any possibility no matter how remote. Steiner was questioned, his home was searched, his reputation was damaged, and ultimately he was cleared of any involvement. The pattern repeated itself through the winter and into the spring of 1886. Suspects were identified, arrested, held, investigated, and released. Each arrest was accompanied by newspaper coverage suggesting that the killer had finally been caught. Each release was followed by editorials criticizing the police for their incompetence. The cycle of accusation and exoneration created its own momentum, separate from any actual progress in solving the crimes. Morris remained in custody longer than most, not because the evidence against him was stronger, but because his foreign status and lack of connections meant he had no one to advocate effectively for his release. His case became a cause for a small group of reformers who saw in his treatment an example of the injustice that characterized the legal system's handling of marginalized populations. They raised money for his defense, brought pressure on the authorities to either charge him or release him, published articles challenging the racial assumptions that had led to his arrest. In April of 1886, after more than 3 months in custody, Morris was finally released. The prosecutor acknowledged that there was insufficient evidence to proceed with charges. Morris disappeared from the historical record at that point, presumably leaving Austin as quickly as possible, taking with him the experience of being imprisoned for months because his appearance and circumstances made him a convenient target for a city's fear and rage. His release came at a time when the city had begun to accept that the case might never be solved, that the killer might never be identified or caught. The murders had ceased, or at least slowed to the point that they were no longer the dominant fact of Austin's existence. The last confirmed killing in the series had occurred in late December. Months had passed without incident. The patrols had been discontinued. The servant quarters were slowly being reoccupied. Life was returning to something approximating normalcy, though the scars remained, visible in the empty buildings that had once housed servants, in the changed relationships between employers and employees, in the lingering anxiety that accompanied any discussion of safety or violence. The investigation remained officially open, but active pursuit of the killer had effectively ended. The case files filled several boxes, stuffed with witness statements and theories and false leads, and the accumulated paperwork of a year-long investigation that had produced nothing of value. Detectives occasionally reviewed the material, hoping that some overlooked detail might suddenly reveal its significance, but the reviews yielded nothing. The killer, whoever he was, had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The city wanted to believe that Morris had been the killer, that his arrest and imprisonment had somehow stopped the murders, even though the timeline and evidence made this impossible. The alternative, that the killer remained free and unidentified, was too disturbing to accept. So a fiction developed, never explicitly stated but widely held, that the case had been essentially solved even if the technical details of proof and prosecution had not been completed. Morris's release was framed not as an exoneration, but as a technicality, a failure of the legal system rather than evidence of his innocence. This fiction allowed Austin to move forward. It allowed the city to close the psychological books on the terror, even while the actual case remained open. It allowed families to sleep at night without believing that a murderer still walked among them. The cost of this fiction was borne by Morris and by the other innocent men who'd been arrested and held and damaged by their association with the crimes, but their suffering was considered acceptable even necessary, for the restoration of communal peace. The Malay cook disappeared into history as a footnote, a name mentioned in connection with the Austin murders, but rarely with any acknowledgement of his innocence or any recognition of the injustice he had suffered. His story illustrated the mechanisms by which fear transforms into scapegoating, how the need for resolution overrides the requirements of justice, how easily the vulnerable can be sacrificed to satisfy the demands of the powerful, and somewhere, perhaps still in Austin or perhaps far away, the actual killer lived with his memories, with whatever he had felt while committing his crimes, with the knowledge that he had terrorized a city for more than a year and had escaped without consequence, without punishment, without even being identified. He knew what he had done. He knew that he had gotten away with it. And if he felt anything at all about that fact, if he experienced satisfaction or relief or contempt for the authorities who had failed to catch him, he kept those feelings to himself and carried them with him wherever he went and took them to his grave when his time came. Chapter 9. The Silent Spring. Spring arrived in 1886 with bluebonnets covering the hills around Austin and mockingbirds returning to nest in the live oaks along the streets. The Colorado River ran full with snow melt from the distant mountains, and the air carried the scent of fresh growth, of things beginning again after the long dormancy of winter. The city stirred itself like someone waking from a fever dream, uncertain whether the nightmare was truly over or simply paused, waiting to resume. The last murder that could be definitively attributed to the series had occurred on Christmas Eve. Nearly 4 months had passed without incident. The patrols that had walked the streets through the fall and winter had been disbanded. The boarding houses where servant girls had crowded together for safety began to empty as women returned to their former arrangements or found new positions that offered private quarters. The businesses that had closed or curtailed their hours reopened. The theatres scheduled evening performances. The restaurants extended their service into the night. Slowly, cautiously, life returned to patterns that resembled the time before the terror. But the return was incomplete. Something fundamental had changed in Austin. Some basic trust had been broken that could not be fully repaired. Houses that before the murders had kept their doors unlocked now featured heavy bolts and reinforced frames. Windows that had been left open on warm nights now remained shuttered and barred. Dogs that before had been kept as pets or for hunting were now valued primarily for their capacity to raise alarm. The physical architecture of the city had been altered by fear, and those alterations would remain long after the immediate threat had passed. The social architecture had changed as well. The relationships between employers and servants, never equal but previously governed by a set of understood conventions, had been disrupted by the murders and the aftermath. Servants who had fled the city were not easily replaced. Those who remained commanded higher wages and better conditions, using the scarcity of labour to negotiate terms that would have been unthinkable 2 years before. Some families, unable to find or afford domestic help, learned to manage their own households, a change that revealed how dependent they had been on labour they had taken for granted. The black community in Austin had borne the heaviest burden of the terror. Most of the victims had been black women. The investigation had focused suspicion on black men, subjecting them to arbitrary arrests, beatings, and the constant threat of lynch law. The Christmas murders had shifted some of the fear to white families, but this shift had not translated into any additional protection for the black population. Instead, it had simply expanded the circle of fear without addressing the underlying vulnerability that had made the servant community the killer's primary hunting ground. The churches that had seen such dramatic attendance during the height of the crisis found their congregations returning to normal size. The revival meetings that had drawn hundreds now attracted only the faithful few. The apocalyptic sermons gave way to messages about rebuilding and moving forward. Ministers who had interpreted the murders as divine judgment now spoke of mercy and restoration. The theological crisis, like the civic crisis, was being resolved through a collective decision to move on, to treat the past year as an aberration rather than as something that required fundamental reckoning or change. The newspapers gradually reduced their coverage of the murders. Where once every edition had featured updates on the investigation, speculation about the killer's identity, and advice for staying safe. Now the topic appeared only occasionally, usually in connection with some anniversary or when a new theory emerged that briefly revived interest. The editorial pages moved on to other concerns: railway development, water rights, political controversies, the ordinary business of a growing city that had more pressing matters to consider than crimes that had ceased. The investigation continued in theory, but not in practice. Detectives nominally assigned to the case spent their time on other matters. The evidence collected during the murders remained filed away in the police department, unexamined, gradually deteriorating as paper yellowed and ink faded. Occasionally someone would suggest reopening the investigation, would propose some new approach or the theory. But these suggestions led nowhere. The institutional will to pursue the case had evaporated along with the immediate crisis, and victims' families left Austin, unable to continue living in the place where their loved ones had been murdered. Others stayed but withdrew from public life, retreating into private grief that found no outlet in the official record. There were no monuments erected to commemorate the dead. No public ceremonies acknowledged their suffering. The victims were buried and forgotten, their graves marked with simple stones or not marked at all, their names preserved only in newspaper archives and police files that few would ever consult. The question of the killer's identity became a subject of speculation and rumour rather than active investigation. Some believed he had left Austin, had moved to another city where he might be continuing his crimes under different circumstances. Others thought he had been killed, perhaps in an unrelated incident, perhaps by someone who knew his secret and took justice into their own hands. Still others believed he remained in Austin, living among them. His crimes known only to himself, his appearance and behaviour ordinary enough that he attracted no suspicion. Theories proliferated in the absence of facts. Perhaps the killer had been a railroad worker, someone who travelled through Austin periodically and committed murders during his stays in the city. Perhaps he had been a medical student or a doctor, someone with knowledge of anatomy and access to sharp instruments. Perhaps he had been a religious fanatic, acting out some twisted theology of punishment and purification. Perhaps he had been insane, his murders the product of a broken mind rather than any coherent motive. Each theory had its adherents, and none could be disproven, and so they coexisted in a fog of uncertainty that would never fully dissipate. The only certainty was that the murders had stopped. Whether they had stopped because the killer had died or left or simply decided to cease his activities, no one knew, but the cessation itself was treated as a kind of resolution, proof that whatever had caused the terror had been resolved, even if the mechanism of that resolution remained mysterious. Austin chose to accept this ambiguous ending, rather than continue to live with the anxiety that an unsolved case necessarily produced. Summer arrived with temperatures climbing back toward the extremes that had characterized the previous year. But this summer felt different. The heat was oppressive but not ominous. The nights were dark but not terrifying. People ventured outside after sunset. Children played in yards until late evening. The sounds of ordinary life, conversations and laughter and music returned to streets that had been silent for months. The city was not healed exactly, but it was functioning, and that was enough. In the servant quarters behind the houses, women slept with doors that now had proper locks, with windows that now had bars, with neighbours close enough to hear if something went wrong. The arrangements were not ideal, but they represented an improvement over the total vulnerability that had existed before. The murders had forced changes that made life marginally safer, though those changes had come at a terrible cost and would never have occurred without the pressure of crisis. By autumn of 1886, more than a year after the worst of the killing, Austin had achieved a kind of equilibrium. The murders were part of the city's history now, events that had happened rather than threats that continued. Newcomers arrived who knew about the terror only through stories told by long-time residents. Children who had been too young to understand at the time grew older without carrying the visceral fear that their parents would never entirely lose. The passage of time did what investigation and justice had failed to do. It created distance, allowed for perspective, made it possible to think about the murders as discrete events in the past rather than as ongoing trauma in the present. But the distance was never complete for those who had lived through the terror at its height. They carried the memories with them always, the knowledge of what had happened when darkness fell and doors were tested and screams went unheard. They knew that civilization was thinner than it appeared, that the structures of law and order could fail, that the vulnerable could be destroyed without consequence. They had learned these lessons in the most brutal way possible, and the learning could not be undone by the passage of peaceful months or the city's collective decision to move forward. The spring had been silent, the summer had been quiet, the fall arrived without incident, and gradually Austin allowed itself to believe that the nightmare was truly over, that the killer would not return, that life could continue without the constant shadow of fear. The belief was provisional, uncertain, always vulnerable to being shattered by another attack. But as weeks became months and months accumulated toward a full year without murder, the belief strengthened into something approaching confidence. The servant girls still locked their doors at night. The family still kept weapons within reach. The dog still barked at unfamiliar sounds. But these precautions became routine rather than desperate, habits rather than survival measures, the ordinary wariness of city life rather than the acute terror of being hunted. And that transition from crisis to memory, from present danger to historical event, marked the true end of the terror even more than the cessation of the actual murders. Austin had survived. The cost had been high, the dead numbered at least 8, and possibly more, and the psychological damage extended to everyone who had lived through those months of fear. But the city endured. It rebuilt its sense of safety. It reconstructed its routines. It moved forward into whatever future awaited, carrying the scars but no longer bleeding from the wounds. And the killer, whoever he was, wherever he had gone, passed into legend, a figure of nightmare rather than flesh. A story told in whispers rather than a man who might be encountered on the street. A memory that would fade with each generation until only the historians remembered. And even they could not say for certain who he had been or why he had done what he had done. Chapter 10. The Shadow That Remained. The Austin murders entered history as an unsolved mystery, a series of crimes that occurred and then ceased without explanation, leaving behind only questions and the weight of unfinished business. The case files remained in the police department for decades, occasionally consulted by researchers or true crime enthusiasts, but never yielding any new insights that might lead to identification of the perpetrator. The victims were buried and largely forgotten, except by those who had known them personally, and as those people died, even that personal memory faded into the general silence that attends the unmourned dead. But 3 years after the Austin murders stopped, in the autumn of 1888, another series of killings began in a city half a world away. London's Whitechapel district became the hunting ground for someone who would be known as Jack the Ripper, and the similarities between the London murders and the Austin murders would eventually lead some investigators to wonder whether the two series might be connected, whether the killer who had terrorized Texas might have crossed the ocean to continue his work in England. The parallels were striking. Both series targeted vulnerable women, prostitutes in London's case, domestic servants in Austin's. Both involved extreme violence, including mutilation and evidence of sexual assault. Both occurred at night in areas where the killer could move unseen. Both series began suddenly, continued for a period of months, and then stopped just as suddenly without the killer being caught. Both investigations pursued numerous suspects without ever securing a conviction. Both left behind a legacy of fear and speculation that would outlast any memory of the actual victims. The differences were equally significant. The Ripper's victims were killed in the streets or in doss houses, not in their own quarters. The London murders occurred over a shorter time span, concentrated into a few months, rather than spread across more than a year. The Ripper communicated with newspapers and police, sending letters that might have been genuine or might have been hoaxes. while the Austin killer never made any attempt to claim credit or explain his actions. The level of public attention was vastly different, with the London murders receiving international coverage, while the Austin murders remained largely a regional story. Nevertheless, the possibility of a connection intrigued investigators then, and continues to fascinate researchers now. The theory emerged that the killer might have been a sailor or merchant who travelled regularly between American and British ports. Such a person could have been in Austin during 1884 and 85, then in London during 88. The transient nature of maritime work would explain why the killer could move between cities without leaving traces, why he could disappear from one location and appear in another without anyone noticing the connection. One suspect received particular attention in this regard. A Malaysian cook who had worked on ships travelling between Galveston and London was identified as someone who could have been in both cities during the relevant time periods. The racial identification and occupation matched the profile of Maurice, the man arrested in Austin, though whether they were the same person or simply similar types remains unclear from the historical record. This Malaysian cook was investigated by London police but never charged, and like Morris in Austin, he disappeared from official records after being released from custody. The theory of a transoceanic killer appealed to the Victorian imagination, which was fascinated by the idea of criminal masterminds who could operate across vast distances, who possessed the intelligence and resources to elude capture in multiple jurisdictions. It appealed as well to the racist assumptions of the time, which preferred to believe that such extreme violence must come from foreign sources rather than from within the domestic population. A Malaysian sailor moving between ports was the perfect vehicle for these projections, exotic enough to seem capable of incomprehensible acts, mobile enough to explain the geographic spread of crimes, and conveniently othered in ways that protected the self-image of white society. But the theory remained speculation. No evidence definitively linked the Austin murders to the Ripper killings. The similarities could be explained by the fact that certain patterns of violence recur across time and place, that killers who target vulnerable women often employ similar methods regardless of cultural or geographic context. The connection existed primarily in the realm of possibility rather than proof, and over time, as both cases remained unsolved and the original investigators died, the question of whether they were related became impossible to answer with any certainty. Austin itself chose to forget. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, as the city grew and modernized, as the generation that had lived through the terror died off and was replaced by people who knew the story only as history, the murders faded from collective memory. The buildings where the crimes had occurred were torn down or repurposed. The streets were renamed. The servant quarters that had once stood behind every substantial house disappeared as social patterns changed and live-in domestic service became less common. The physical evidence of that era was systematically erased by progress and development and the natural evolution of urban space. The newspapers that had covered the murders so extensively were archived in libraries, their pages growing brittle and yellow, consulted rarely and then only by specialists. The police files were eventually transferred to state archives, where they mouldered in boxes, occasionally examined by historians but never yielding the breakthrough that might solve the case. The victims' graves, those that had been marked at all, eroded under decades of weather until names and dates became illegible. The human beings who had lived and died in such terrible circumstances were reduced to abstractions, data points in studies of historical crime patterns, names in databases of unsolved cases, yet the shadow remained. Austin never entirely escaped the memory of what had happened in those months when darkness brought terror and mourning brought discovery of new horrors. The city's self-image was permanently marked by the knowledge that it had been vulnerable, that its structures of law and order had failed, that evil had moved through its streets with impunity. The confidence that had characterized the city's attitude toward itself in the early 1880s, the belief in progress and civilization and the steady improvement of human society had been shattered by the murders and never fully restored. The legacy manifested in unexpected ways. Austin's resistance to certain forms of development, its tendency toward conservatism in matters of public safety, its complicated relationship with its own history, all bore traces of the trauma that had been inflicted during those months of killing. The city had learned that terrible things could happen without warning, that the structures meant to protect could fail, that the vulnerable could be destroyed and their destroyers could escape without consequence. These lessons shaped policy and attitude long after the specific details of the murders had been forgotten. The story persisted in oral tradition among the descendants of those who had lived through the terror, particularly in the black community where most of the victims had come from. The names might be forgotten, the specific dates might become confused, but the essential truth remained. There had been a time when it was not safe to sleep, when the servant quarters were death traps, when women died and no one came to save them. This knowledge was passed from generation to generation, not as historical curiosity, but as lived experience that continued to shape how people understood their relationship to power, safety, and justice. In the early 20th century, a newspaper reporter attempted to investigate the murders, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the terror and reviewing what remained of the police files. His articles revived interest briefly, generating speculation about possible suspects and theories about the killer's identity, but the investigation led nowhere. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses had died. Too much evidence had been lost or destroyed. The mystery remained a mystery, and the reporter eventually abandoned the project, adding his failed attempt to the long list of unsuccessful efforts to solve the case. The 1920s brought a book, one of the first true crime volumes to examine the Austin murders in detail. The author compiled all available information, interviewed surviving witnesses, and proposed his own theory about the killer's identity. The book sold modestly and was largely forgotten within a few years. Later researchers would criticize its methodology and conclusions, but it at least preserved some information that might otherwise have been lost, recorded some memories that would have died with their holders. As the 20th century progressed, the Austin murders became the subject of academic study. Criminologists examined them as early examples of serial killing. Historians used them to explore social conditions in frontier Texas. Sociologists analyzed them as case studies in how fear shapes community response. The murders were abstracted, analyzed, incorporated into theoretical frameworks that treated them as data rather than as human tragedy. This academic attention at least kept the story from disappearing entirely, but it also completed the process of transforming lived experience into historical artifact, of turning suffering into scholarship. The 21st century brought new technologies and new interest. DNA analysis offered the possibility of solving cold cases that had been unsolvable by earlier methods, but the Austin murders predated forensic evidence collection. The bodies had been buried for more than a century. The crime scenes no longer existed. There was nothing to test, no samples to analyze, no physical evidence that might yield its secrets to modern science. The case remained as unsolvable in the age of computers as it had been in the age of gas lamps. True crime enthusiasts kept the story alive in books, podcasts, websites, and documentaries. The mystery of the killer's identity proved endlessly fascinating, generating theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Some researchers believed they had identified the killer through historical records and circumstantial connections. Others dismissed all such claims as wishful thinking, arguing that the evidence was simply too fragmentary to support any definitive conclusion. The debate continued without resolution, as it would likely continue as long as anyone cared enough to debate. And somewhere in the accumulated records of births and deaths, marriages and migrations, census data and ship manifests, court records and newspaper archives, the killer's name almost certainly existed. He had been born, had lived, had moved through the world, leaving traces in the documentary record just like everyone else. He had worked jobs, lived in houses, interacted with other people. He had not been a ghost or a supernatural entity, but a human being who had committed terrible acts and then either stopped or continued them elsewhere. His identity was knowable in theory, but in practice it remained hidden behind the veil of time and the inadequacy of historical sources. The victims were even more thoroughly lost. Toits. Their lives had been rendered invisible by their social position even before they died. The historical record preserved almost nothing about who they were as people, what they hoped for, what they feared, how they understood their own existence. They were known only through the manner of their deaths, their humanity reduced to the violence that had been done to them. This final indignity, this erasure of everything except their suffering, was perhaps the cruelest legacy of the murders. Austin grew into a modern city, eventually becoming known for music and technology and education, rather than for the terror that had gripped it in the 1880s. New residents arrived with no knowledge of the murders. Buildings rose where the crime scenes had been. Streets bustled with life where once had been only fear and violence. The city moved forward, as cities must, building on top of its own past. Layer upon layer of history compressed beneath the present moment. But the shadow remained, in archives and in memory, in the gaps in the historical record where names should have been, in the unanswered questions that would never be answered, in the knowledge that evil had come to Austin in the summer of 1884 and had never been made to account for what it did there. The shadow remained, faint but permanent, a reminder that civilization is fragile, that justice is uncertain, that the vulnerable have always been prey, and that sometimes the monsters go unpunished, disappearing into history or legend, leaving behind only the weight of what they destroyed and the silence of all that can never be known. The candles burned low, the archives closed, the river flowed on, carrying the red soil toward the Gulf, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human memory. And history, having turned its page in the dark, moved on to other tragedies, other mysteries, other shadows that would cast themselves across the future and refuse to fade.